Prime Minister Scott Morrison has used a third and final leaders' debate to criticise his opponent for supporting a minimum wage rise in line with inflation. The debate was dominated by wages and cost of living after the Opposition Leader Anthony Albanese earlier this week said he'd support a minimum wage increase in line with inflation of around 5%. Dr. John Buchanan is Director of the Workplace Research Centre at the University of Sydney and he joins us now. John Buchanan, welcome. So can governments have a significant influence on the decisions of the Fair Work Commission?
Yes, there's absolutely no doubt about that. They can't direct the Commission to make a particular decision at the federal level. At the state level, governments have legislated to say what the upper increase can be, but at the federal level, it's the Fair Work Commission or a special panel of it that makes the final decision about pay. But it listens to arguments from many people, and the Commonwealth Government, has quite some influence when it puts arguments.
And have governments traditionally put arguments before the Fair Work Commission when it comes to making these decisions?
If you look back at over 100 years of wages policy, yes, governments usually have put in a clear statement of what they think the state of the economy is and what the quantum of the wage increase should be. It's only in the very recent past that the federal government has basically squibbed it and just put a whole lot of data in front of the Commission and hasn't made a call on what the final number should be.
And so does the minimum wage decision set an example for other wage decisions?
I think this is the critical issue, and people have noted that Australian wages have been flat for a very long time. And that's because beginning with the New South Wales state government about 10 years ago, there was a legislative maximum of how big wages could rise. That then put if you like, a ceiling on how far wages could rise, and that's created what's called a community norm. I'm an expert in wages policy. I've been looking at this stuff for over 35 years, and the economy sets limits at the above and below what wages can move, but the actual precise level at which wages are set is ultimately determined by institutional factors. And a notion of a community norm and what the Commission sets us, that notion of a community norm has a very big influence. And when setting that community norm, it listens very closely to the arguments of unions, employers, but fundamentally governments are regarded as a key player in the game.
And despite that being a New South Wales state decision, do you think that had national implications?
Oh, absolutely. Every state in the Commonwealth, in our federation, followed that lead. The federal government has had a tacit wages policy of holding wages way down below inflation and productivity movements, and that Australia has had basically active wage suppression for the last 10 years. It's well recognised in economics that wages should move with the cost of living and productivity. That's been a long-standing, it's almost like a deep empirical regularity. That connection between wages and price movements and inflation and price movements on the one hand and wages on the other has been broken. And this is not something that's been recognised by just marginal economists. The OECD, the International Labour Organisation, the World Bank have all noted that there's been a problem that wages have not kept up with the cost of living and productivity for many decades now, and this is the problem. And when Anthony Albanese says there's been a spike in inflation, he's quite legitimate in saying workers for many, many years now have been getting wage increases below productivity and price movements, and enough's enough. I think he's quite right to say that.
And it's your view that governments have played a key role in what you call this wage suppression?
Absolutely. And like I say, this is not... Setting wages is a complex business, and we're very lucky in Australia that we have developed institutions at state and federal level which look at these complex factors. They make a decision every year, and then they come back and they make an assessment. Did we make the right decision? And if they made the wrong decision, they then recalibrate their decisions. And in making their decisions, they are completely transparent. Almost anyone who's got an interest in wages policy can make a submission to the Fair Work Commission. The Catholic Church does. The Australian Council of Social Services does. It's not just the ACTU and the employers. It's a very transparent process. And all those arguments and all that data's put in, the tribunal, the panel looks at that information, and if it makes a mistake, it has to listen to people come back and say you made a mistake. And so Australia's very lucky. We've had these institutions for over 100 years now. They've served us extremely well. And what's changed in the recent past is that the federal government has basically dealt itself out of serious deliberations by not putting in a proposed wages norm. And I think it's time we went back to the historic practice of actually governments showing some lead in this space.
Yeah, as you say, say Australia is very lucky to have this system, but it sounds like you're unimpressed with what's happened over the last decade in terms of wages suppression and this disconnect. So in your view, what has gone wrong?
Look, fundamentally, there's been an assumption that wages have been a principal source of economic instability and they must be held down. And treasuries historically have been very hostile to workers getting wage increases. They were particularly annoyed with what happened with the industrial tribunals giving pay increases that took account of changes in the value of work people did. And they said, we don't like this. And they persuaded mainly Liberal governments to put legislation which said industrial tribunals shouldn't have a free hand in setting wages. They should be told what the absolute maximum is. And when you do that, it means those tribunals can't make a decision based on all the information. They've had their, both hands tied behind their back. Now, that has a big impact. And we've seen that. And like I say, this is organisations like the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, it's the World Bank, it's the International Labour Organisation, have noted that because of policies like these where wages have been suppressed, most of the gains of productivity have accrued to business. And let's be quite clear about this. The average Australian worker now is producing about 50% more than they did 30 years ago for the same amount of effort. Most of that productivity gain has gone to business. And this is something that those key international organisations have identified as a fundamental problem in the economies. It's dysfunctional. And unless we start to get back to a point where wages are linked more to the cost of living and linked to productivity, we're going to have unbalanced growth. And so that's what's being talked about now. People say, and I heard the Treasurer say, Anthony Albanese was being economically reckless. Well, really, Anthony Albanese has, the OECD, the World Bank and the International Labour Organisation on his side on this particular issue.
Yeah, we heard, I think, the Prime Minister yesterday with words to the effect that a wage rise like this would be pouring fuel on the fire of inflation and cost of living. What do you make of that characterisation of what Anthony Albanese has proposed?
Look, we're in an election and people say things that they're incomplete statements. I haven't seen the precise statements of Anthony Albanese. I know that there's the quantum out there, but with our industrial tribunals, we have the capacity to be quite flexible in how we change policy. So the tribunal, for example, could say, we'll give the full 5% to the lowest income earners, but those at higher levels, even people around median earnings, will just say, no, you only get 3%. You can in fact have differential wage increases. You can stagger it over time. Australia in the 1980s and 1990s had big increases in its minimum award rates, but they were implemented over a 4 or 5 year period. So it's not like you just have to do it all in one hit. You can, like I say, differentiate it across the workforce and you can differentiate it over time. But having a norm out there is important to actually change the direction, because at the moment we're on a direction which basically is holding wages down. We've got to get onto a trajectory where there's a better balance so that the workforce shares in the gains of growth. At the moment, it's been picking up the crumbs on the side.
And we're coming to the end of this election campaign now. Key issue is wages. Anthony Albanese is saying under a Labor government, wages, you can be assured that wages will be higher. Scott Morrison is saying that's a con and that Anthony Albanese does not have a magic pen. Can one party make a claim that wages would be higher under its leadership or not? Do governments have a key influence over what happens in the wages system?
Yes, look, I think They're a key influence. It's kind of like when you're making a cake. You've got to have a key ingredient. You've got to have bicarb of soda or eggs to make it rise or whatever. Government policies and government stances are a key ingredient, but they're not the whole story, right? So you can't say the government will decide on something and that will happen, but it will be an important player in the mix. Gough Whitlam, when he was elected, said he would use government policy and wages policy and set up government as an employer of choice and set a norm in that way. And that did have an effect. You've basically seen the New South Wales Liberal government say we're going to set a wages norm, we're going to be a model employer, but we're going to suppress wages. So governments can have a quite significant indirect impact. They can't determine exactly what happens, but they can shape the environment quite profoundly and have a major impact overall.
John Buchanan, it's been really good having a chat to you. Thanks so much for your expert analysis.
It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you. Thanks, Joe.